Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Our next speaker is Susan Chapelle. Susan Chapelle is an inventive leader with a highly successful career building businesses, leading as a two-term elected politician and influencing changes that improve organizations and emergent industries. Susan has scaled businesses in healthcare, technology, and collaborative workspaces. She has advised global technology companies on development of online platforms and integrations. She is a keynote speaker on digital innovation and smart cities, technology, and a published researcher in the fields of neuroscience and wound healing mechanisms. Susan has presented her studies and consulted across the globe. Susan is excited to open minds and bring better access to human performances as CEO of HAVN Psychedelics. Susan, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Psyched.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you sharing this day. Okay, I am going to be speaking today on conscious capital and psychedelics. So with this renaissance we're experiencing now, I'm going to be sharing my screen right now. Okay, you can see my screen okay?
Yep.
Perfect. So conscious capitalism and psychedelics. With this renaissance, it is amazing how many companies are going public these days, the difference between public and private, the difference between research and innovation and moving the space of access to evidence-informed medicines into the public, not just the public psyche, but into public markets and shared capital resources. So psychedelics are incredibly unique in the pharmaceutical space. They are not built on single compounds, although the research being done is in single compounds. They're built on changing our perspective. They're an adjunct to therapy. They are not often taken by themselves, but in most of the research projects, they are facilitated and guided. And it's really fascinating to also understand that this comes from a historical place, a cultural space with cultural experiencing, and a very holistic experience. That introduction was great. HAVN Research and HAVN Life is a new company that we are starting so that we can help people gain access to evidence-informed compounds for the research and clinical trial space, as well as developing nutraceuticals. My history with psychedelics is very similar to other speakers on this podcast and also other CEOs in the space. Most of us come to psychedelics through some personalized experience. Me, it was access to, I ran a cancer clinic and treated cancer patients for post-surgical care. My experience in the space showed me that people need to be able to access full entourage effect and different medications that can actually help their overall wellness and well-being and change their perspective about themselves and their pain. I became a city councilor to integrate those healthcare practices into my municipality so that cancer patients could gain access to cannabis. And my experience with psychedelics is very similar, that changing your perspective when you have a healthcare issue that affects your entire life is such an important resource for anybody suffering with mental health or illness. And now these compounds are being looked at for so many other different effects. Currently, there are 264 clinical trials going on just through the NIH, the National Institute of Health in the United States, but they are all international studies looking at OCD, cancer, headaches, Alzheimer's. It's a pretty well understood mechanism, and understanding its effects on human health is massive. So again, back to the slide set, the unique experience. Every experience with psychedelics is a unique experience. The war on drugs propaganda, which I'm really enjoying watching the film in between. Thank you to the presenters. The war on drugs propaganda has changed our entire perspective on botanical and full spectrum plant and fungi medicine, and has been a really, we can look at all sorts of compounds that are opioids, that have negative effects on our organs, that have negative effects on our well-being, that have all been pharmaceuticalized, and yet these compounds that are naturally derived that you can go pick in the forest or grow in your backyard have been criminalized. Had a great effect on community. The entourage effect I've spoken to as well, but fungi as medicinal compounds, it's experiencing the exact same effect as cannabis had with THC and CBD, that we're really only looking at the psilocybin compound when mushrooms have known stacks of compounds that could be beneficial to human health. The safety profile on these compounds is incredibly, it's amazingly well understood. These compounds have been studied since the 1970s and have very little negative outcomes attributed to them. I love this slide because it basically, I come from a neurobiology background and publishing in wound healing and understanding neurobiology of inflammatory effects and how nerves regenerate. Psychedelic medicines have been found to have neuroregenerative properties, and many of the speakers have spoken about interconnection between neural processes in the brain. And working with a company that's looking at bringing microdosing to the space, has looking into the research on neuro effects and neuroplasticity has been really fascinating for myself. The long-term research and clinical trials are still needed and ongoing. And with this mass amount of clinical studies going on and still very little understanding of negative effects and outcomes, we are going to need a compound library and compounds to understand the effects of these compounds and be able to distribute compounds to researchers and investigators that are doing clinical studies. And as these studies scale to include larger groups of humans, safety and compounds coming from being derived organically, I think is an incredibly necessary process for our space. Accessing capital for this is very difficult right now in the private space. There are very few companies that are going public, but public markets can be a wonderful way to actually gain since the space has come from this very organic space with historical background, with clinical research background from the 1970s, with so many researchers being absolutely quoted in the news, making all the publications into public consciousness now. I really feel that the capital markets for psychedelics may be a beneficial space, whereas in cannabis, where I came from, the capital markets were very much led by individuals that had no connection with the plant, had no connection with research, and were incredibly biased to raising funds to just gain capital and no other altruistic ways. HAVN is the company that we developed. We're very proud of HAVN being an absolutely diverse and women-led company. There are currently only 2 female CEOs in the psychedelic space, which I'm hoping will change through glass ceiling breaking. The amazing part about HAVN is we're looking at novel compounds and building an entirely new methodology for scaling the compounds so that researchers can have access to the compounds that they need to study and scale their research projects to larger amounts of people or animal studies. So what we're doing is we have a research license in right now, and we're looking to standardize a methodology for growing compounds at scale. So naturally derived mushrooms, and then being able to derive the compounds with partnerships with labs. Our team is incredibly diverse. We have a lot of women and culturally diverse, which brings a great amount of creativity. I like to say that we're mostly wrong, but when we're right together. We are all able to challenge each other's ideas and bring ourselves along as a group. And I'm extremely proud of the fact that we've built such a diverse and women-led team in this company. So we're in the 20th century now. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it with diversity in the space. And this diversity is an incredibly, obviously, I did this slide set before the disruption in the States with Black Lives Matter, but the amount of diversity in leadership really needs to change in all of our public companies and our private companies in order to bring new ideas to the space and to innovate. Working on human problems is a very psychedelics research space idea. The idea that we can transform people's mental health is not a new one. And I'm pretty sure that most of the people on this podcast are listening understand the benefits that psilocybin and other mushroom compounds can have on mental health. Collaboration across sectors is new as well. And I'm hoping that through public markets, I want to make comparisons, even though oftentimes I don't like making comparisons to the cannabis market because this is a completely different and better research product and compound. The effect of having collaboration across sectors and being able to help each other out with the total goal of being able to rescue this absolute pandemic of mental health that is global now. The amount of people suffering from mental health issues is also a pandemic that needs to be treated as such. And we need to be working together to reform policy, to change people's minds about these compounds, and to bring better access to the space. The idea of corporate social responsibility is brand new in this space as well. Tech went through its renaissance in Silicon Valley, and it took 10 years for people to notice that there was no real product involved in a lot of these startups. And after 10 years, people demanded to see product and were a little bit more skeptical after 2008 and the market breakdown with all of these companies. Same with cannabis. It was the exact same massive green investment in cannabis space with not a lot of outcomes and not a lot of research or access to research or really understanding how the cannabis compounds can affect human health. I like to refer to THC and CBD as compounds that are amazing and people understand the benefits, but there's no mechanism. Whereas psilocybin and fungi compounds, there's very well understood mechanisms, receptors are affected, and that companies that are science-based and can speak to the science of psychedelics are going to be 20th century companies that are worth looking at and helping out to get products to market. Community economics, local community economic development is another factor in economic collaboration and across sectors that can actually help small communities gain access to having smaller companies in their space, which will require zoning changes, infrastructure changes, having research centers in different communities, and involving the community in the research as well, so that you're bringing people along to change the perception of these compounds and to normalize it as an economic generator in communities. Building resilience in our companies as well, and long-term strategies and being able to bring products to market that will be accessible to people. Doesn't just include psilocybin, but other mushroom compounds and normalizing the use of mushrooms as an entire botanical for natural healthcare products. Supply chain localization is something that is incredibly important to me. We've developed a lot of supply chains in other sectors that are spread out and require a huge amount of fossil fuel to transport. So HAVN being located in Vancouver and being able to standardize, Canada has very few compound libraries and access to compounds for researchers. So building compounds and localizing that supply chain so that we can be located. We're also located at the University of British Columbia, so it makes getting researchers our compounds very simple. Pandemics and healthcare systems. We have seen through COVID that we can adjust the healthcare system with evidence-informed knowledge. So understanding that, before our pandemic, we were looking at a 4 to 12 years to change healthcare and systems. So systems for access to healthcare need to be informed by evidence. And we know through COVID now that the ability to pivot and get to a supply chain of compounds, or the ability to help researchers develop compounds that can help human health can be expedited and doesn't have to be such a painful process. The change that has to happen in our markets, in our governments, in our values, leadership, in our infrastructure, our policy, technology, and the access that we have to these compounds, all has to be done as a collective. That bringing all of these things to a place where they are sustainable, where there's no corruption, where the money coming into the space is because people see a long-term outcome for mental health and access to compounds that have entourage effects and that are plant medicine and that can help humans gain health and gain access to mental wellness is such an essential piece. The leadership of our companies has to be diverse and not just, a lot of the psychedelics companies have one ethnic background deciding on the entire company. And we've talked about this since the 1960s, and it's really quite amazing that now in pandemics and with equity and diversity, all of these subjects were talked about in the 1960s. There was a psychedelics renaissance in the 1960s, and we haven't actually moved forward at all. We need to have a proper renaissance where we have used technology, we use leadership, we use infrastructure to access medicine that is actually for the people. I am going to stop early. I've presented quite a bit of information. I want to thank all of you for caring enough to joining a psychedelic conference, and the fact that we have access to being able to present to each other and learn from each other in a virtual platform is much appreciated.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Let's just jump in directly into some of the questions from our audience. So the first one is from Drew. You discussed the downfall of the cannabis industry. Most people believe that is because of a lack of IP driving a race to the bottom. Given that you are looking at natural products, which will face the same challenges, how will you avoid that same fate?
That's a really, as HAVN, or yes, being the CEO of a company, that is my primary directive. I did come from the cannabis industry where I was not in leadership, but noticed that there wasn't a product getting to market, that we were relying on capital markets, we were taking a lot of money in, but not actually developing a product. And I was always curious how rolling a joint could earn or multiple millions of dollars when the gray market, community-based market. So it's a very different compound than cannabis. And it does require equipment and researchers and clinical resources to be able to facilitate. It's also a drug that, psilocybin is a drug that is a facilitated drug. It also has a gray market, but because of the complications in developing the supply chain, is a very small market and a much more difficult to access market. You don't find people really grow, the people that are really interested are growing mushrooms in their closets. And I think there's going to be more and more people buying spores and developing personalized medicine. But I think there's going to be a lot more technology integrations with being able to do facilitated trips out of through telemedicine. I think that the clinic development space is going to be robust, and that the natural healthcare space of compounds that are not regulated is going to be an exploding space. So we're hoping to develop the supply chain. But primarily, I'm really interested in developing the methodology for growing so that we can grow compounds at scale and keep them organic.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, definitely. What are some of the, really innovative things that you saw come out of the cannabis movement in regards to growing specifically that you feel like haven't really been explored yet in psychedelics?
I love that question. Thank you. So I love agri-tech. So because cannabis was an illegal business for so long, even though it was federally regulated in Canada, the federal regulated spaces were all indoors. And the fact that we had to grow plants indoors really changed technology. And now we're seeing in cannabis, I always point to Stewart Farms, who's doing that they're basically growing using fish and the biome. We're seeing vertical spaces that are expanding, so vertical growing. We're seeing light technology and spectrum technology come out in our lighting. So there's so much amazing technology that's helping people grow plants and derive better compounds and standardized compounds so that people can gain medicine. But I also feel like that medicinal space has really been turned into a recreational space. And even though fungi and those compounds are used for recreation, and that can be of benefit, I would never say no to recreation and yes to medicine. I think that both spaces have benefit. But the technology and the amount of innovation in both the spaces is going to be exploding. And they're both nascent industries that, now we can expound the technology from the gray market and transfer it into a legalized market and utilize that technology for both developing new companies that can help with community economic development and bring monetization to the space. But your previous presenter was presenting on extraction equipment that's now moving into fungus. So I love all the development in the space with technology.
Mm-hmm. There's very much a culture in cannabis that, I was made aware of only, a few years back, which was, how different strains can really affect the experience based on things like terpene profiles, et cetera. And I think that same conversation is really, bubbling up more into the public eye in regards to mycology and mushrooms specifically. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, do you think that the range of effects of different types of mushrooms will be as broad as it was with the cannabis plant?
That's a really interesting question. And I come from the neurobiology side, so the effect on human health, but the compound development, we have our scientists, Ivan Castleman, he's an ethnobotanist, and every ethnobotanist that I've talked to, which I've spoken to quite a few, have expounded they're not just interested in psilocybe. And they feel the same way about the psilocybe SPP compounds as they do about the THC and CBD compounds, that it's just one small spectrum in the mushroom, and that the entourage, we haven't explored the entourage's effect. And I think all the synthetic compounds that are being studied in research, used in research, we should be looking at a broader compound base, and that there's going to be multiple effects with different compounds. And because we haven't had access to these compounds, there's going to be so much more research on receptors and the effect on our different receptors. And I was really, oh my gosh, it was glutamine. Yeah, glutamine was one of the receptors, and I was really interested in that because I hadn't heard of glutamine. Craig Trester was talking about glutamine effects. There's just so many different effects that all of these compounds can have. And another space is anti-inflammatory. They could be massive anti-inflammatory effects, which is why it may be beneficial for cancer and the other peripheral diseases that we have. Not just centrally located, but peripheral neuropathies haven't been really studied. And I really look forward to more research on the effects of peripheral neurology.
Yeah, there's, as cannabis has gained popularity, there's been a lot of individuals, for instance, on my LinkedIn feed that are saying, oh, well, CBD or, just whole plant cannabis is really great for X, Y, and Z and everything in between. And it's sometimes difficult to tell how many of those claims are substantiated, unsubstantiated. Do you have ideas for how we can basically build a culture around psychedelics to be able to, I guess, maybe upvote, if to put it, in a crude way, information and knowledge that is, I guess, a little bit more robust in regards to what psychedelics are capable of and what they're not.
You're speaking my language. I think this space comes from a very evidence-informed place, and the CEOs that are in the space want to help human health. Every single podcast I've listened to that is speaking to a psychedelics company, they're all talking about mental health and wellness, or that they came to the space from a disease profile. And you're absolutely right. Making claims outside of evidence is standard in natural healthcare products, in most treatment paradigms. And this may not be popular, but the cultural effects that we have, and seeing great benefit to facilitated trips in all cultures across that where people experience revelations can have an effect on many different diseases. So then we tend to leap from, I had this experience and this N=1 persona where, I had this experience, it helped me here, therefore psychedelics are good for this. But it's also playing out in clinical trials right now. With, when you go on the .gov website and you look at the amount of clinical trials actually doing controlled studies, the effects are quite substantial. So it's almost impossible not to say that psychedelics have this grand effect overall. And the same with, whereas CBD and THC had no studies and came from a very N=1 place, where CBD was good for everything and had no studies proving benefit. And in fact, it was quite the opposite, is that most studies were not placebo controlled, and or the outcome was exactly the same in placebo controlled studies as a control. So I think that psychedelics, because we have a great history, and we're working with right now, David Moakler is one of the pioneers in this space. He did some of the first LSD studies in the 1970s and participated in cannabis studies. And he's working with HAVN as well to help us work on compound development. And just looking at his vast amount of research from the 1970s, but yet he had to get his compounds from the FDA, where if he didn't state that it had a negative outcome, he couldn't derive compounds. So I'm hoping that things shift, and it's amazing to see the amount of positive studies going on, not just, how can we help people not get addicted, or, the war on drugs propaganda is massive still, and changing political culture so that we have funding to be able to do the science that's needed, and that it's not all privately funded or single compound derived, that we can actually have proper clinical studies going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love for you to dive in a little bit more into some of the work that you might be doing to advance or change drug policy.
That's, so I ran for council. I was on city council for 2 terms to help change drug policy. Our town was prohibition when it came to dispensaries. And we're still not talking, there's just now a constitutional challenge going on, and it made the news. It was actually last night. It was the first time I'd seen it in the news on popular media, on global television, that there's a constitutional challenge that hospice patients want to be able to access magic mushrooms. So supporting any petitions that are going on, signing petitions is so important. But yeah, running for council based on land use and access to medicine was getting involved in politics, but also voting. You don't have to run for politics, but supporting people that share the belief that psychedelic medicine has to be a part of our entourage of medication that's available to people suffering from a myriad of diseases. But you have to get pretty pissed off to deal with local politics. And my cancer patients being harassed by the police every day was too much for me to bear. And I put forward a motion that allowed municipal dispensaries to be located. We ended up having 5 municipally licensed dispensaries. And when legalization happened, our safety unit which was the RCMP mixed with the provincial police, came in and raided all the municipally run dispensaries and left us with only one legal dispensary for access for our patients, which doesn't have the community-based products, the extraction products, the variety that patients actually need to get well. So legalization has had a lot of consequences for patients. And I'm hoping that psychedelics can learn from cannabis and that we have a really robust, that it'll be a prescription service that you can go and actually get prescribed psilocybin. But accessing these compounds is going to be really difficult, and we have to build a robust supply chain so that when it becomes legal through constitutional challenges, as cannabis did, that we have an appropriate, community-based, and big enough supply chain of compounds. It can't be run by single companies.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Susan, thank you so much for talking with us today. Really appreciate your time, and excited to keep talking offline.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.